It's fantastic to see so many old friends and old faces here, and just to really commemorate this this date exactly 25 years ago. I travel around. I've just been starting to travel again, and I find myself saying to people that if you ask the question, how is it that the United States, which for basically a century was the global champion and proselytizer and enforcer of the global war on drugs, at the same time became the global leader in legalizing marijuana? The answer, most of the answer, dates back to what happened in California in 1996 in the victory for Prop 215. There's no other way to explain, that paradoxical relationship. And the other thing I'll often say about that is that looking at this in a broader drug policy reform perspective, which has been my lens on this thing, what you see is that what this victory in California in 96, and to some extent another one in Arizona at the same year on treatment instead of incarceration, those were the first times that the nascent drug policy reform movement showed that we could play ball in the major leagues of American politics. It changed just about everything. Right? Now, I'm just going to flash back to where, sitting where I sat back in this years, how medical marijuana became, and the Prop 215 became the event that drew me in and that really transformed my life in a way as well. I've been drawn, in studying the drug war and writing about it and speaking about it since the late 1980s. Some of you may remember the names Arnold Trebeck and Kevin Zeese, two people who recently passed away, who founded the Drug Policy Foundation. And it was a place where many people in the medical marijuana movement and marijuana reform movement also met people engaged in racial justice and sentencing reform and the psychedelics and harm reduction, all of that. Right? I probably met Dennis there at one point. And I remember going to visit him at that 5-story building in 95 and seeing the window looking out over City Hall and being so struck by the energy that was going on here. I remember at the same time thinking this had to be there was a point with Drug Policy Foundation where they would give out awards, and there was a Citizen Activist Award named after Bob Randall, the historic figure who really got this thing moving back in the 1980s, the 70s and 80s. And I remember arranging for him together with Edith Springer, otherwise known as a goddess or godmother of harm reduction, to jointly receive that Randall Award. But I'm sitting here now. I've been a professor at Princeton. I got on a call of the blue from a guy named George Soros back in 92, who was not yet famous, and we'd hit it off. One thing led to another. I start up my drug policy reform organization called the Linda Smith Center as part of Soros's emerging foundation in 94. But it's all about public education. There's nothing really political going on. We don't see opportunities. These were the years of the Congress's Crime Act, the horrific 1996 Crime Acts that escalated penalties. So the whole war on drugs, incarceration is just increasing all over the place. There's a movement around harm reduction and needle exchange to stop the spread of AIDS that's just beginning to get some ground, and I see this along a parallel track. Psychedelics and Rick Doblin and MAPS is just a tiny organization beginning to try to promote things here, right? Marijuana legalization or decriminalization had its little bit of a heyday in the 70s, almost died in the 80s, and it's coming back in the 90s. Now, in early 95, I'm in a position with a new friend of mine, a guy named Chuck Blitz in Santa Barbara, to organize a gathering in Santa Barbara to bring together some of the leading activists in the drug policy reform movement from this area. I think Dale was the one representing medical marijuana in California, a range of other national activists, some of the new donors who are emerging, some of the political professionals who my friend Chuck had introduced me to. Bill Zimmerman is sitting on the table here. And we considered this. Dale presented it. And we thought, okay, this looks interesting. It looks, the polling, this homegrown provision, which is essential, but the public doesn't go for it. Let's think about it. But a bunch of things had happened. Since I'd left the university, I'd met Soros. And one day in talking to Soros, I mentioned medical marijuana. And he says, why did he like the issue? Because it was the intersection between his interest in drug policy reform writ large and the other first interest he had, which was death and dying with dignity. And for Soros, he saw that nexus there, and that's what hooked him. Then there was Peter Lewis, who had made a grant to the ACLU that had done a big poll on marijuana legalization and medical marijuana, and realized that there were ways in which working on the medical marijuana issue might dovetail into stimulating a broader discussion around marijuana legalization. And then there was George Zimmer, who I had met at a State of the World forum in San Francisco in 95. It turned out we'd gone to the same high school, him 10 years before me. He was interested in this thing, and we hit it off. And then there was John Sperling, the left-wing professor who started the University of Phoenix down in Arizona, wanted to end the drug war, legalize all drugs, and he had an initiative in mind in Arizona. And I was in a fortunate position to know Dennis, to know Dale, to know Ed Rosenthal, to know many of the activists in California, and to have met some of the political professionals like Bill Zimmerman, and to have met Soros at this point, and Peter Lewis, and George Zimmer, and John Sperling, most of whom did not know one another, and to be able to pull these pieces together. You know, and then I remember, but I wasn't jumping at this, and it was hard. And then one day in late '95, I get a call from Ed Rosenthal saying, Ed, come on. Ed goes, Ethan, come on, you got to help us. Can't you get Soros and those other guys? And he said, call Dennis. Called Dennis. Dennis says, no, Ethan, we'll do it as a volunteer effort. So I left it. A month later, Ed calls again. He says, Ethan, what happened? I said, I called Dennis. He called Dennis again. I called Dennis. He goes, well, I guess we could use a little help, right? You know, and Ed's going, maybe $25,000, $50,000. I then called this professional Zimmerman, and he said, actually, you know, it's going to be more like $1.5 million if you want to get an initiative on the ballot in California. And at that moment, it was back to Soros, back to Lewis. They're asking, is there somebody in California who's going to be part of that partnership? That was George Zimmer, the crucial California anchor, putting up the money that enabled, you know, Soros and Lewis to come into this. And George was bonding with other people in the field. Well, I can tell you, it was one wild fucking ride. I mean, I got to tell you, this signature collection, are we going to make it or not? The last moments, all of a sudden, the internecine politics, people flipping out. There were the medical marijuana activists who were saying, I don't give a damn about broader marijuana legalization. And then there were marijuana legalization folks who were saying, why focus on medical marijuana? You're going to set back the momentum for broader legalization. You're going to peel off the most sympathetic victims of the war on marijuana, and you'll delay that. And then there were the acolytes of Thomas Sass, my good friend and ally, the anti-psychiatry psychiatrist, saying, you're empowering the medical establishment, and even worse than the criminal justice establishment. All of these little internecine things we forget about 25 years later. But the fact of the matter was, you know, it all did manage to come together. I remember Chris and Mickey as real troopers, and Debbie Goldsberry and others as real troopers out there collecting the signatures on the volunteer effort. I remember people really busting their ass to make this thing happen. And we didn't know on election day that we would win, but in fact we did, getting more votes for Prop 215 than Bill Clinton got in his re-election effort. Now, what we also know is that victory opened it all up. Some months later, Bill and I went back down there, and you know, we looked at where else can we do this. We scanned the other 24 states with the initiative process. We looked at where were the ones that were cheap enough that we could run with and that were big enough. And Alaska, Oregon, Washington, Colorado, Nevada, and Maine. And we launched ballot initiatives to legalize medical marijuana in all of those states, and won all 6 of those between '98 and 2000, right? Before the states began. That opened up the world some years later to the same pattern of behavior of getting the Western states and a few others to legalize marijuana through the initiative process so that other states could follow. The momentum built because when people in other areas of criminal justice reform around harm reduction and needle exchange and fighting the stigma against methadone maintenance and sentencing reform and psychedelics, all of this saw the leadership, the pioneering role that Prop 215 played. It did, we all made history. Great to see you all.